The year was 1943, and the world burned under the shadow of the greatest war humanity had ever known. In the smoke-filled back rooms of London, Washington, and Moscow, men and women who had never met face-to-face played a game more dangerous than any battlefield. They were the spies of the Allied powers, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, bound by a fragile alliance against Hitler's Reich. But beneath the handshakes and toasts lay a web of suspicion, deceit, and betrayal that would reshape the war and the world that followed. This is the story of those shadow games, the betrayals that tilted the balance of power, and the secrets that still echo in the corridors of history. Imagine yourself in a dimly lit room in wartime London. The blackout curtains are drawn tight, and the only light comes from a single desk lamp casting long shadows across maps pinned to the wall. A man sits there, his face gaunt from sleepless nights, his fingers stained with ink. His name is Kim Philby, a charming British intelligence officer with a disarming smile and a knack for making friends in high places. To his colleagues in MI6, he is a rising star, a man destined for greatness. But Philby harbors a secret that would shock the world. He is a Soviet spy, a committed communist who has been feeding Moscow the most guarded secrets of the British Empire for nearly a decade. Philby's story begins in the 1930s, when idealism was a currency many young men traded in. Born in India in 1912 to a prominent British civil servant, Harold Adrian Russell Philby, Kim, to his friends, grew up in the fading glow of the British Empire. At Cambridge University, he fell in with a circle of brilliant, idealistic students who saw the rise of fascism in Europe and the failures of capitalism at home. The Great Depression had left millions jobless, and the Soviet Union, with its bold promises of equality, seemed to some a beacon of hope. Philby was one of them. Recruited by Soviet intelligence in 1934, he was instructed to bury his ideals deep, to infiltrate the British establishment, and to rise as high as he could. By 1943, Philby had done just that. He was a senior officer in Section 5 of MI6, responsible for counterintelligence against the Axis powers in Spain and Portugal. His charm and intellect opened doors, and his reports were meticulous. But every piece of intelligence he gathered, every German agent uncovered, every Allied plan discussed, found its way to Moscow. Philby was not alone. He was part of the Cambridge Five, a ring of spies that included Donald Maclean, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross. Together, they were a dagger aimed at the heart of the Western Alliance, and their betrayals would have consequences that rippled far beyond the war. Across the Atlantic, in the bustling chaos of Washington, D.C., another betrayal was unfolding. Elizabeth Bentley, a 35-year-old American with a sharp mind and a knack for blending into crowds, had once been a fervent communist. Recruited by the Soviets in the 1930s, she became a courier, ferrying secrets from American officials to her handlers in New York. By 1943, she was deeply embedded in a network that included scientists, bureaucrats, and even military officers. One of her key sources was Harry Dexter White, a high-ranking official in the U.S. Treasury Department. White, a brilliant economist who helped shape the Bretton Woods system that would govern the post-war world, was passing sensitive financial intelligence to the Soviets. His motives were complex, part ideological, part pragmatic. He believed the Soviet Union was a necessary ally against Hitler and saw no harm in sharing information that might strengthen the coalition. But Bentley was growing uneasy. The deeper she sank into the world of espionage, the more she saw the human cost. Her Soviet handlers were ruthless, demanding more and more while offering little in return. By 1945, disillusioned and fearing for her life, Bentley would walk into an FBI office and confess everything, exposing a network that reached into the highest levels of the Roosevelt administration. Her defection would send shockwaves through Washington, but in 1943, her work continued in secret, unnoticed by the Allies who trusted their Soviet partners. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Joseph Stalin sat at the apex of a paranoid empire. The Soviet leader was a master of betrayal, having purged his own ranks in the 1930s to eliminate any perceived threat. Now, as the Red Army pushed back against the Germans on the Eastern Front, Stalin demanded intelligence from his allies to ensure Soviet dominance in the post-war world. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, ran an extensive espionage network in Britain and the United States, exploiting the openness of democratic societies. Stalin knew the Allies were planning a second front in Western Europe, an invasion of Nazi-occupied France. He wanted every detail: troop movements, landing sites, supply lines. And thanks to men like Philby and sources like White, he often got them. The stakes of these spy games were immense. The Allies were fighting not just for victory, but for the shape of the world to come. Britain, battered by the Blitz and clinging to its empire, sought to preserve its global influence. The United States, rising as an economic superpower, envisioned a world of free markets and democratic ideals. The Soviet Union, scarred by millions of deaths and driven by Marxist ideology, aimed to spread communism and secure a buffer against future invasions. Espionage was the currency of this struggle, and betrayal was its sharpest edge. One of the most audacious Soviet operations was the penetration of the Manhattan Project, the Allied effort to build the atomic bomb. In 1943, the project was in its early stages, centered at Los Alamos, New Mexico, under the direction of J. Robert Oppenheimer. The bomb was the ultimate weapon, a scientific marvel that could end the war in a single catastrophic stroke. The Soviets knew this, and they were determined to steal its secrets. Their opportunity came through Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist who had fled the Nazis and joined the British scientific effort. Fuchs was a quiet, unassuming man, but his commitment to communism ran deep. Recruited by the Soviets in 1941, he began passing detailed technical data on the bomb's design to his handlers. Fuchs's betrayal was a slow burn. He didn't hand over blueprints in a single dramatic meeting. Instead, he shared fragments, equations, calculations, progress reports over months and years. By 1943, his information was helping Soviet scientists, led by Igor Kurchatov, lay the groundwork for their own bomb. The Allies had no idea. Oppenheimer trusted Fuchs, as did the British scientists who vetted him. The Manhattan Project was a fortress of secrecy, but Fuchs was a crack in its foundation. Back in Europe, the Allies were planning Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy that would become D-Day. The operation was a logistical marvel, involving millions of men, thousands of ships, and a deception campaign to mislead the Germans about the landing site. The British led the charge on deception, with Operation Fortitude creating a fictional army under General George Patton, supposedly poised to strike at Pas-de-Calais. The plan relied on double agents, fake radio traffic, and inflatable tanks to fool German reconnaissance. It was a triumph of misdirection, but it also depended on secrecy. If the Germans learned the true target, Normandy, the invasion could fail, and with it the Allied cause. Philby, now head of MI6's Soviet counterintelligence section, was in a position to know everything. His job was to track Soviet spies in Britain, a cruel irony given his own allegiance. He attended meetings where Overlord was discussed, saw maps of the landing beaches, and read reports on troop deployments. Much of this information went straight to Moscow. Stalin, ever cautious, used it to calibrate his own demands for a second front, pressing Churchill and Roosevelt to act faster while quietly preparing for a post-war Europe where Soviet influence would dominate. But not all betrayals favored the Soviets. The Allies had their own spies in Moscow, and one of the most remarkable was a man known only as Max, operating under the cover of a diplomatic posting. Max was a Western agent who infiltrated the Soviet General Staff. His reports, smuggled out through a network of couriers, revealed Stalin's plans for the post-war occupation of Eastern Europe. Max's intelligence confirmed what many in London and Washington suspected. Stalin had no intention of honoring the promises of free elections made at Yalta. His goal was to install puppet governments in Poland, Hungary, and beyond, creating a Soviet sphere that would rival the West. Max's work was perilous. The NKVD was everywhere, and a single misstep could mean death. He operated in a city where fear was a constant companion, where neighbors informed on neighbors and walls had ears. Yet his reports reached the West, shaping Allied strategy and sowing the seeds of the Cold War long before the hot one ended. His betrayal of the Soviet Union was a quiet counterpoint to the louder treasons of Philby and Fuchs, a reminder that the spy game cut both ways. As 1943 gave way to 1944, the tensions within the Allied alliance grew. Churchill, ever wary of Stalin, pushed for a stronger British presence in the Balkans to counter Soviet ambitions. Roosevelt, more trusting, believed cooperation with Moscow was the key to a lasting peace. Their spies, wittingly or not, fueled this divide. Philby's reports to Moscow exaggerated British distrust, while Soviet disinformation fed American suspicions of British imperialism. The alliance held, but cracks were forming, and the betrayals within it were the hammer blows widening those cracks. In the Pacific, another shadow war was unfolding. The United States was locked in a brutal campaign against Japan, island hopping toward the home islands. American codebreakers had cracked Japan's diplomatic and military ciphers, giving Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur a decisive edge. But the Soviets, neutral in the Pacific until the war's final days, were hungry for intelligence on Japan. Through their agents in the U.S. State Department, they learned of American plans for the post-war occupation of Japan and the strategic bombing campaign that would culminate in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. One Soviet agent, a low-level clerk in the State Department named Lachlan Curry, passed tidbits of gossip and policy papers to his handlers. Curry wasn't an ideologue like Philby. He was a pragmatist who saw the Soviets as allies and thought sharing information was harmless. But those tidbits, combined with other sources, gave Moscow a clearer picture of American intentions than the Americans realized. When the Soviets entered the war against Japan in August 1945, their rapid conquest of Manchuria owed much to this intelligence. The human cost of these betrayals was incalculable. Every secret shared with Moscow strengthened Stalin's hand, prolonging the war in subtle ways. German agents, tipped off by Soviet intelligence, tightened their defenses in places. Scientists like Fuchs accelerated the nuclear arms race, ensuring that peace would be shadowed by mutually assured destruction. And ordinary soldiers, British, American, Soviet, died in battles that might have ended sooner had trust prevailed over treachery. Yet the spies themselves were not cartoon villains. Philby was a man of contradictions, a patriot to a cause he believed would save the world, even as he betrayed his country. Bentley was a woman caught between ideology and fear, her defection as much a cry for survival as a moral awakening. Fuchs was a scientist who saw communism as the antidote to fascism, blind to the tyranny it cloaked. Their stories are not just tales of espionage, but of human frailty, of choices made in the crucible of a world on fire. As D-Day approached, the spy games reached a fever pitch. The Allies were poised to strike, but the Soviets were watching, waiting, and planning. Philby, now a trusted figure in MI6, was preparing to move to an even more sensitive post. Bentley was on the verge of breaking. Fuchs was deepening his commitment to Moscow. And in the shadows, Max and others risked everything to pierce the veil of Soviet secrecy. The invasion of Normandy would be a triumph, but the betrayals that surrounded it would cast a long shadow, one that would stretch from the beaches of France to the dividing lines of a divided Europe. This is only the beginning of the story. The betrayals of 1943 and 1944 were just the opening moves in a game that would redefine the century. What happened next? How these spies shaped the end of the war and the birth of the Cold War will leave you questioning who really won and at what cost. Stay with me, because the next chapter reveals the moment everything changed. June 6, 1944. The beaches of Normandy shook under the thunder of artillery and the screams of young men wading through blood-red surf. Operation Overlord had begun, the greatest amphibious invasion in history. For the soldiers storming Omaha and Utah, Gold and Juneau, Sword and Point du Hoc, survival was measured in minutes. For the spies in London, Washington, and Moscow, survival was measured in secrets. D-Day was not just a battle. It was the fulcrum on which the betrayals of the Allied intelligence war pivoted. What happened in the weeks and months that followed would decide not only the fate of Hitler's Reich, but the shape of the peace that came after. In a cramped office in Ryder Street, London, Kim Philby lit another cigarette and stared at the latest intercept from Bletchley Park. The ultra decrypts, German messages cracked by the Enigma codebreakers, painted a picture of confusion in the Wehrmacht High Command. Hitler believed the Normandy landings were a feint, that the real blow would still come at Pas-de-Calais. Operation Fortitude was working. Inflatable tanks, fake radio chatter, and double agents like Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo, had sold the lie. Philby's job was to ensure no Soviet mole inside MI6 compromised the deception. The irony was bitter enough to taste. Every ultra summary he read, every detail of Allied progress, was photographed by a hidden camera in his flat and passed to his Soviet handler, a grizzled NKVD officer named Anatoly Gorsky. Philby's reports to Moscow were masterpieces of selective truth. He confirmed the success of Fortitude, assured Stalin that the Second Front was real, and fed just enough detail to keep the Red Army's strategy aligned with Allied advances. But he withheld the full scope of Ultra, knowing that if Moscow learned how completely the Allies had penetrated German communications, they might demand access, and suspect British withholding when it was denied. Philby walked a tightrope, betraying his country while protecting his cover. His Soviet masters praised his work, but they were impatient. They wanted more: the exact timing of the breakout from Normandy, the strength of Patton's Third Army, the plans for the liberation of Paris. Across the English Channel, the deception held. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B, begged Hitler for reinforcements to throw back the beachhead. Hitler refused, convinced by Garbo's fabricated reports that Calais was the true target. By the time the Führer realized his mistake, it was too late. Allied armor poured inland, and the road to Paris lay open. The success of D-Day owed much to the double agents who fooled the aware, but it also owed a debt to Philby's silence. Had he revealed the full extent of Fortitude, Stalin might have pressured Roosevelt to share Ultra with Moscow, fracturing the alliance at its most critical moment. In Washington, the mood was jubilant but wary. President Franklin Roosevelt, frail and confined to his wheelchair, received daily briefings from Wild Bill Donovan, head of the Office of Strategic Services, OSS. Donovan's agents were parachuting into France alongside the resistance, sabotaging railways and ambushing German convoys. But Donovan had a problem: leaks. Someone inside the OSS was passing operational details to the Soviets. The culprit was Duncan Lee, a Rhodes Scholar and OSS officer who had been recruited by Elizabeth Bentley. Lee's motives were ideological. He believed the Soviet Union deserved to know what its allies were planning in Europe. His reports included the locations of OSS teams in France, the names of resistance leaders, and the timing of supply drops. Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, used this information to coordinate their own partisan operations in Eastern Europe, ensuring that when the Red Army advanced, local communists were in position to seize power. Bentley herself was unraveling. The pressure of her double life, courier by day, spy by night, was taking its toll. Her Soviet handler, a brutal man named Jacob Golos, had died of a heart attack in 1943, leaving her adrift. His replacement, a cold NKVD officer known only as Al, demanded more risk for less reward. Bentley began drinking heavily, her once sharp instincts dulled by gin and fear. She knew the names of dozens of Soviet agents in the United States, scientists, diplomats, even a congressman's aide. If she talked, the network would collapse. But talking meant treason, and treason meant prison, or worse. The NKVD had a long reach. In Los Alamos, the desert sun baked the makeshift laboratories where the atomic bomb was taking shape. Klaus Fuchs worked late into the night, his slide rule clicking as he calculated the critical mass of uranium-235. His Soviet contact, a chemist named Harry Gold, met him in Santa Fe under the guise of discussing family matters. Fuchs handed over a folder of notes, the latest on the implosion design, the challenges of the plutonium trigger. Gold, nervous but professional, tucked the papers into a briefcase and vanished into the night. The information reached Moscow within weeks, where Igor Kurchatov pored over it with his team. The Soviet bomb, codenamed RDS-1, was still years away, but Fuchs's betrayal had shaved months, perhaps years, off the timeline. The ethical weight of Fuchs's actions haunted him. He had seen the horrors of Nazi Germany firsthand, had lost friends to the Gestapo. He believed the bomb in Soviet hands would deter future aggression, that a balance of terror was better than Western monopoly. But in the quiet of his barracks, he sometimes wondered if he had unleashed a monster. The Americans trusted him completely. Oppenheimer called him a good man, and General Leslie Groves, the Manhattan Project's hard-nosed director, had personally approved his security clearance. The betrayal was invisible, a ghost in the machine of the greatest scientific endeavor in history. As summer turned to autumn, the Allies pushed deeper into France. Paris was liberated on August 25, 1944, in a carnival of joy and retribution. But behind the celebrations, the spy war intensified. In London, Guy Burgess, another member of the Cambridge Five, joined Philby in MI6. Burgess was flamboyant where Philby was restrained, a drunk where Philby was disciplined. But his access was just as valuable. Assigned to the Foreign Office, Burgess saw cables about the post-war division of Europe, the negotiations for the United Nations, and the delicate talks with Stalin about Poland. He passed it all to Moscow, often via Philby, who acted as the conduit. The Polish question was a festering wound. The Polish government in exile in London demanded free elections and the restoration of pre-war borders. Stalin, whose troops now occupied eastern Poland, had other plans. He backed the Lublin Committee, a communist puppet government, and arrested leaders of the non-communist resistance. The West knew something was amiss, but hard evidence was scarce. That evidence came from a Soviet cipher clerk named Igor Guzenko, stationed in Ottawa. Guzenko was no ideologue. He was a low-level functionary who saw the war's end as a chance to defect. In September 1944, he began copying documents, lists of Soviet agents in Canada, details of espionage against the Manhattan Project, and orders to infiltrate the Polish exile community. He hid the papers in his apartment, waiting for the right moment to cross the line. Guzenko's defection would not come until 1945, but its seeds were planted in 1944. His documents would confirm what the West feared, that Stalin's promises at Tehran and Yalta were lies, that the Soviet Union was preparing to swallow Eastern Europe whole. But in the heat of the war, such warnings were drowned out by the need for unity. Roosevelt, ever the optimist, believed Stalin could be trusted. Churchill, ever the realist, knew better but was powerless to act alone. In the Pacific, the spy games took a different turn. The United States was closing in on Japan, but the cost was staggering. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 was the largest naval engagement in history, and American codebreakers again proved decisive. But the Soviets, still neutral, were gathering intelligence for their eventual entry into the war. Through agents in the State Department and the OSS, they learned of the firebombing campaigns against Tokyo and the plans for an invasion of the Japanese home islands. This intelligence shaped Soviet strategy in Manchuria, where Stalin was quietly building an army of 1.5 million men. One Soviet source was particularly valuable, a Japanese diplomat named Hatsumi Ozaki, part of the Richard Sorge spy ring in Tokyo. Sorge had been executed in 1941, but his network lived on. Ozaki, before his own arrest, had warned Moscow of Japan's plans to strike south rather than north against the Soviet Union. That warning allowed Stalin to transfer Siberian divisions to the European front in 1941, saving Moscow. Now, in 1944, remnants of the Sorge Ring fed Moscow details of Japan's dwindling oil reserves and the state of its navy. When the Soviets finally struck in August 1945, They did so with precision, occupying Manchuria and Korea in a lightning campaign. Back in Europe, the winter of 1944 brought new crises. The Battle of the Bulge caught the Allies by surprise, Hitler's last desperate counterattack through the Ardennes. American troops were overrun, and for a moment, the German breakthrough threatened to split the Allied armies. Philby, now privy to the highest-level briefings, sent Moscow a detailed assessment of the crisis. Stalin, facing his own winter offensive, used the information to demand more Lend-Lease supplies and to press for a faster Allied advance in the West. The Bulge was contained, but the cost was 80,000 American casualties, a price made steeper by the knowledge that a trusted ally was watching every move. The human toll of these betrayals was not just in bodies, but in trust. Every leaked plan, every compromised agent, eroded the fragile bond between East and West. Spies like Philby and Fuchs were not lone wolves. They were symptoms of a deeper malaise. The war had forced strange bedfellows, and ideology had blurred the lines between friend and foe. In the OSS, agents trained alongside NKVD officers in sabotage techniques. In London, MI6 shared office space with Soviet liaison officers. The closeness bred contamination, and the contamination bred betrayal. As 1944 drew to a close, the end was in sight, but not in reach. Germany was crumbling, but Japan fought on. The atomic bomb was months from completion, and the Soviets were racing to catch up. The Yalta Conference loomed, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin would carve up the world. The spies knew what was coming: a peace built on lies, a victory shadowed by suspicion. Philby prepared for his next move, a posting to Washington that would give him access to the heart of American intelligence. Bentley teetered on the edge of defection. Fuchs steeled himself for the final push on the bomb. And Guzenko, in far-off Canada, counted the days until he could break free. The stage was set for the final act. The betrayals of 1944 had kept the alliance alive, but they had also poisoned it. What happened at Yalta, in the bomb labs, and in the shadowy corridors of power would determine whether the war's end would bring peace or merely a new kind of war. The next chapter will take you to the conference table where the world was divided, to the desert where the bomb was born, and to the moment when the first spy broke ranks and changed everything. You won't believe what they were willing to risk and what they were willing to sacrifice to win a war that was already slipping into the shadows of the next one. February 1945. The Crimean resort of Yalta, draped in winter mist, became the unlikely stage for the greatest betrayal of trust in modern history. Three men, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, sat around a heavy oak table in the Levadia Palace, maps spread before them like a butcher's chart. They spoke of liberation, of free elections, of a United Nations to keep the peace. They toasted with vodka and cognac. But beneath the smiles, each leader knew the others lied. And in the shadows of the palace corridors, the spies listened, recorded, and prepared to twist every word to their own ends. Kim Philby was not at Yalta, but his fingerprints were all over the British delegation's briefings. Promoted to head of Section 9, the new Soviet counterintelligence unit in MI6, he had spent January poring over Foreign Office cables, Polish exile reports, and ultra-intercepts on Soviet troop movements. Every document crossed his desk twice, once for London, once for Moscow. His handler, Gorsky, pressed for specifics. What concessions would Churchill demand on Poland? Would Roosevelt trade Eastern Europe for Soviet entry into the Pacific War? Philby delivered. A thick dossier, photographed page by page in his St. Albans flat, reached the Kremlin days before the conference opened. Stalin read Philby's reports with a thin smile. The British suspected Soviet intentions in the Balkans. The Americans were desperate to avoid a separate peace with Germany. Armed with this knowledge, Stalin played the generous ally. He promised free elections in Poland, agreed to join the war against Japan 90 days after Germany's surrender, and nodded solemnly at the Declaration on Liberated Europe. Roosevelt, exhausted and dying, believed him. Churchill, chain-smoking cigars in his map room, did not. But Britain was broke, its empire fraying, and Churchill needed American support more than Soviet honesty. The deal was struck. Back in London, Guy Burgess celebrated the outcome with a bottle of gin and a string of indiscretions. Drunk at a Foreign Office party, he boasted to a Soviet diplomat that the Poles are finished. The remark, repeated in Moscow, confirmed Stalin's gamble. The West would swallow the Lublin Committee. Burgess's access to the Yalta debriefs gave Moscow the full text of the secret protocols, agreements on repatriation of prisoners, borders, and the division of Germany, before Churchill's own cabinet saw them. In Washington, the Yalta agreements landed like a thunderclap. Harry Dexter White, still in the Treasury Department, received his summary through Elizabeth Bentley's network. White's motive had shifted. No longer a starry-eyed believer in Soviet utopia, he now saw Moscow as a counterweight to British imperialism. He passed financial intelligence, Allied gold shipments, Lend-Lease accounting, plans for a post-war international bank that would help Stalin demand reparations and control Eastern currencies. The Bretton Woods system, designed to stabilize the world economy, became a Soviet lever before the ink was dry. But cracks were appearing in the Soviet facade. In Ottawa, Igor Guzenko's apartment overflowed with stolen cipher pads. The young clerk had smuggled out over 100 documents, proof of Soviet espionage in Canada, names of agents targeting the Manhattan Project, orders to sabotage Anglo-American relations. His wife, Svetlana, begged him to stop. The NKVD was watching. Guzenko waited, timing his defection for the moment when the war's end would make the West listen. At Los Alamos, the pace was frantic. The Trinity test site was under construction in the New Mexico desert, and the plutonium implosion device, nicknamed the Gadget, was taking shape. Klaus Fuchs, now a key member of the British mission, attended daily briefings on the lens design and the polonium initiator. Each night, he transcribed equations onto onion skin paper, folding them into a copy of the New Yorker for his courier, Harry Gold. In March 1945, Fuchs handed over the complete implosion blueprint. Gold, sweating in the Albuquerque heat, drove to a dead drop in a hollowed-out pumpkin on a farm outside Santa Fe. The pumpkin was collected by a Soviet diplomat driving a battered Plymouth. Within weeks, the design was in Moscow. The betrayal was not just technical. Fuchs's data included yield estimates, 20 kilotons, enough to level a city. Soviet physicists, working in a converted monastery outside Saratov, used the numbers to calibrate their own device. Lavreny Beria, the NKVD chief overseeing the bomb project, reported directly to Stalin. The Americans will have the weapon by summer. We will have it by 1949, perhaps sooner. Stalin nodded, already calculating how the bomb would reshape the post-war chessboard. In April, the world tilted. Roosevelt died in Warm Springs, Georgia, his last act the approval of Yalta's implementation. Harry Truman, the plain-spoken Missourian thrust into the presidency, inherited a war and a web of secrets he barely understood. His first briefing on the atomic bomb came from Secretary of War Henry Stimson. Mr. President, we are building a weapon that will make the blockade of Japan unnecessary. Truman scribbled notes, unaware that half the details were already in Soviet hands. Across the Atlantic, the Red Army closed on Berlin. Soviet tanks rolled through the ruins of East Prussia, and Stalin's political officers followed, installing commissars in every liberated town. The NKVD's SMERSH units, Death to Spies, rounded up German scientists, looting laboratories for uranium samples and rocket blueprints. One prize was the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, where nuclear research had stalled but left behind cyclotrons and heavy water. The haul was shipped east on the same trains carrying displaced persons west. Philby, now preparing for his Washington posting, received a final London assignment: assess Soviet intentions in Germany. His report, circulated to the Joint Intelligence Committee, warned of temporary administrative measures in the Soviet zone. The phrase was deliberately vague. In a parallel report to Moscow, he listed every British agent parachuted into the East, their cipher codes, their safe houses. When the war ended, those agents vanished, arrested, shot, or turned. Elizabeth Bentley made her choice in May. VE Day, May 8, 1945, saw London ablaze with bonfires and Union Jacks. Bentley, hung over in her New York apartment, stared at a photograph of Jacob Golos. The war in Europe was over, but her war continued. She dialed the FBI's New Haven office and asked for Agent Thomas Fitch. "I have information," she said, voice trembling, "about spies in the government." Fitch, a veteran of the Lindbergh baby case, sensed a breakthrough. He arranged a meeting in a roadside diner outside New Haven. Bentley arrived with a cardboard box stuffed with names, dates, and microfilm. The defection had begun. Her confession unfolded over weeks. She named Harry Dexter White, Lachlan Curry, Duncan Lee, and dozens more. She described dead drops in Central Park, brush passes in Grand Central Station, decoded messages hidden in knitting patterns. The FBI, stunned by the scale, codenamed the investigation Silver Master after one of Bentley's key sources. J. Edgar Hoover, obsessed with communists, saw a chance to cripple the Roosevelt legacy. But Truman, wary of partisan attacks, ordered the investigation kept quiet until the evidence was ironclad. In the Pacific, the spy war turned lethal. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9th to 10th killed over 100,000 civilians in a single night. American B-29s, guided by code-broken weather reports, flew unopposed. Soviet agents in the State Department passed the raid schedules to Moscow, allowing Stalin to calibrate his own demands for Pacific bases. When Truman met Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov in April, he pressed for the promised entry into the war against Japan. Molotov, armed with Bentley's leaks, stalled. The Red Army needed time to reposition from Europe to Siberia. On July 16, 1945, the desert bloomed with light. The Trinity test detonated at 5:29 a.m., a plutonium implosion device vaporizing a steel tower and turning sand to glass. Oppenheimer, watching from a bunker, whispered a line from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Fuchs, standing nearby, felt no poetry, only dread. His betrayal was complete. The yield, 21 kilotons, matched his calculations exactly. In Moscow, Beria received a coded cable, the Gadget Works. Exact match. Stalin toasted the scientists with Georgian wine, then ordered the gulags emptied of physicists. The Potsdam Conference opened 10 days later outside Berlin. Truman, Churchill, soon to be voted out, and Stalin met in a bombed-out palace. Truman took Stalin aside and mentioned a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin feigned surprise, congratulated the president, and cabled Beria, "Accelerate." The Soviet leader already knew the bomb's power. Fuchs had described Trinity in detail during a June meeting in Santa Fe. The only question was timing. Stalin wanted the Red Army in Manchuria before the bomb dropped, to claim spoils without sharing credit. Philby arrived in Washington in August, greeted by OSS officers eager for British expertise. His office overlooked the reflecting pool, and his brief was atomic security, irony layered upon irony. He met J. Edgar Hoover, dined with Allen Dulles, and cultivated sources in the State Department. His first report to Moscow, a summary of Truman's briefing to Congress on the bomb. The second, the target list for Japan, Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, Nagasaki. On August 6th, the Enola Gay released Little Boy over Hiroshima. 70,000 died in an instant. Stalin, vacationing in Sochi, received the news by secure teletype. He ordered the invasion of Manchuria to begin at midnight, 2 days ahead of schedule. Soviet T-34s rolled across the border, meeting little resistance from a Japanese army already crumbling. By August 9th, when Fat Man obliterated Nagasaki, the Red Army was 300 miles into China. The Japanese surrendered on August 15th. World War II was over, but the spy war was just beginning. Guzenko made his move on September 5th. Clutching a stack of documents, he walked into the Ottawa Journal newsroom and demanded to speak to a reporter. The editor, skeptical, sent him to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Guzenko's evidence, proof of Soviet espionage against the bomb, against Canada, against the Allies, landed on Prime Minister Mackenzie King's desk. King, a cautious man, cabled London and Washington. The response was panic. If Guzenko talked publicly, the Yalta agreements would collapse. If he was silenced, the Soviets would know the West was weak. Bentley's debriefings reached a crescendo. The FBI confronted Harry Dexter White in a Manhattan hotel room. White, pale but defiant, denied everything. "Miss Bentley is a neurotic fantasist," he said. But the evidence was overwhelming. Hoover prepared a report for Truman. 47 Soviet agents in the U.S. government, penetration of the OSS, the Treasury, the State Department. The president, facing a midterm election, buried it. Philby, sensing the net tightening, began planning his exit. He burned contact lists, memorized escape routes, and cultivated a cover story, a nervous breakdown from overwork. In Moscow, his controllers praised his longevity, but warned, "The Americans are hunting." The Cambridge Five were still intact, but the noose was drawing tight. The war's end unleashed a flood of recriminations. Polish officers in London wept as their homeland vanished behind the Iron Curtain. American GIs in Japan stared at Soviet troops across the Korean demarcation line, wondering why allies were suddenly enemies. Scientists at Los Alamos packed their slide rules, unaware their secrets had birthed a rival arsenal. The betrayals of 1945 did not end the war. They birthed the next one. The atomic monopoly lasted 4 years, not decades. Eastern Europe fell not to ballots, but to bayonets. And the men and women who had played the spy game, Philby in his Washington office, Bentley in her FBI safe house, Fuchs in his Los Alamos barracks, Guzenko in his Ottawa hiding place, carried the weight of a world remade by their choices. The next chapter will follow the hunters and the hunted into the Cold War's opening salvos, the trials, the defections, the moment when the first domino fell and the Iron Curtain slammed shut. You'll see how close the world came to nuclear accident in 1946, how a single cipher clerk in Canada ignited the Red Scare, and how Kim Philby, smiling, charming, lethal, slipped through the fingers of justice one last time. The end of the war was only the beginning. September 1945. The leaves in Ottawa turned gold, but Igor Guzenko saw only bars on his windows. Hidden in a safe house guarded by Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the cipher clerk dictated page after page to stenographers. His documents, 109 in all, were a Rosetta Stone of Soviet espionage. Codebooks, agent lists, cables ordering the theft of uranium sample from the Chalk River Laboratory. One cable, signed by NKVD Colonel Nikolai Zabudin, read, "Obtained from Fuchs all details of the explosive lens. Priority absolute." The Canadians photographed every sheet, then sealed the originals in a vault. Prime Minister Mackenzie King, pacing his office, faced a dilemma. Reveal the truth and shatter the wartime alliance. Bury it and betray Canada's allies. He chose a middle path, quiet consultation with London and Washington. In London, the news landed on Kim Philby's desk like a live grenade. As head of Section 9, he was tasked with assessing Soviet penetration of the British Embassy in Ottawa. His report, circulated to MI5 and the Foreign Office, concluded, Guzenko is a fabricator seeking asylum. His claims are exaggerated. The lie bought time. In Moscow, Beria raged. Zabudin was recalled, shot in Lubyanka's basement. Guzenko's defection exposed a network that reached from Montreal to Manhattan. Philby's calm facade mass panic. If the Canadians shared the documents with the Americans, the Cambridge ring would unravel. Across the Atlantic, Elizabeth Bentley's debriefings entered their third month. FBI agents filled legal pads with names. Nathan Gregory Silvermaster, an economist running a spy cell in the War Production Board. Victor Perlow, passing budget forecasts from the War Department. Abraham George Silverman, leaking aircraft production figures. Bentley described the sound method, conversations in moving cars to evade bugs, and the visual method, signals with curtains or flower pots. Hoover, smelling blood, pushed for arrests. Truman, fearing a diplomatic explosion, hesitated. The Soviets were still allies, occupying half of Europe. An indictment now would hand Stalin a propaganda victory. In Los Alamos, the victory celebrations were muted. Scientists toasted the end of the war, then packed for home. Klaus Fuchs lingered, volunteering for the British team, analyzing Hiroshima's ruins. His final act of betrayal came in a Santa Fe diner on September 19th. Harry Gold, chain-smoking Chesterfields, slid across a napkin sketch of the Nagasaki implosion core. Fuchs added marginal notes: tampered density, initiator timing. Gold whispered, "This is the last." Fuchs nodded, eyes hollow. He believed the transfer would balance power, prevent American hegemony. He did not know Beria had already ordered his recall to Britain, too valuable to risk in the growing storm. The storm broke in November. Mackenzie King flew to Washington, briefcase chained to his wrist. In the Oval Office, he laid Guzenko's documents before Truman. One page listed Alan Nunn May, a British physicist who had worked at Chalk River. May had passed uranium-235 samples to the Soviets in a Montreal park. Truman's face hardened. "We've been stabbed in the back," he muttered. He authorized a joint FBI-RCMP operation. On November 15th, Canadian police arrested Zabudin's courier, a GRU lieutenant named Pavel Angelov. The dominoes began to fall. In London, MI5 moved on Nunn May. Arrested in his Bloomsbury flat, he confessed within hours. "I acted out of ideological conviction," he told his interrogator. The confession reached Philby the same day. He drafted a memo warning of a limited breach in atomic security, then burned his own contact list in the Section 9 fireplace. Guy Burgess, hung over in the Foreign Office, heard the news and vomited in a wastebasket. Donald Maclean, first secretary of the Washington Embassy, cabled Moscow in a panic. "The roof is falling." Moscow's reply was terse: liquidate exposure. Maintain discipline. The arrests triggered a chain reaction. In February 1946, the Canadians charged Nunn May with espionage. The trial was closed, but leaks reached the press. The Daily Express screamed, "Atom spy in British lab." Public outrage forced Churchill, now leader of the opposition, to demand a parliamentary inquiry. Philby testified before a secret committee, voice steady. "The breach is contained. No evidence of wider penetration." His performance was flawless. The committee cleared MI6. In Moscow, Stalin toasted "our English friend." But the Americans were not convinced. Hoover, frustrated by Truman's caution, leaked Bentley's story to the columnist Drew Pearson. On February 5, 1946, Pearson's radio broadcast named Harry Dexter White as a Soviet agent. The White House switchboard lit up. White, summoned to Treasury Secretary Fred Vasey's office, resigned the same day. He died of a heart attack 3 years later, officially of natural causes. Whispers said Digitalis. The Guzenko revelations ignited the Red Scare. In March 1946, Churchill delivered his Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended. Stalin denounced it as warmongering. Behind the rhetoric, the spy hunt intensified. The FBI raided the Silver Master home in Virginia, seizing microfilm hidden in a hollowed-out pumpkin, the same method used in New Mexico. Gregory Silver Master fled to the Soviet embassy, granted asylum. His wife Helen followed, leaving their teenage son behind. In London, Anthony Blunt, art historian and Cambridge 5 member, quietly removed incriminating files from the Courtauld Institute. As surveyor of the King's pictures, he had access to Buckingham Palace. He used it to photograph MI5 reports on Soviet art looting in Germany. The negatives reached Moscow via a Spanish diplomat. Blunt's motive was pure ideology. He believed culture belonged to the proletariat. His betrayal went unnoticed for decades. The atomic spy hunt reached Los Alamos in spring 1946. General Groves, paranoid about leaks, ordered lie detector tests for every scientist. Fuchs passed with flying colors. His training in tradecraft included controlled breathing. But Harry Gold cracked. Arrested in Philadelphia for passing counterfeit money, a side hustle to fund his espionage. He confessed everything under questioning. "I worked for a man named Raymond," he told the FBI. "He gave me papers from Los Alamos." The trail led to Fuchs. On January 17, 1950, years later, but the investigation began in 1946. Fuchs was confronted in his Harwell office by MI5's William Scarton. "We know about Santa Fe," Scarton said. Fuchs stared at the floor, then nodded. His confession filled 27 pages. Dates, dead drops, the implosion lens. He was sentenced to 14 years, the maximum for passing secrets to an ally. In Moscow, Beria cursed the loss but celebrated the haul. The Soviet bomb, RDS-1, detonated on August 29, 1949, for years after Trinity. The Fuchs case shattered the myth of Allied unity. Truman, facing midterm losses, created the Loyalty Program in March 1947. 4 million federal employees filled out questionnaires. Are you now, or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? The purge began. Alger Hiss, a State Department official named by Bentley, was indicted for perjury in 1948. His trial became a national obsession, fueling Senator Joseph McCarthy's rise. Philby watched the chaos from Washington. As MI6 liaison to the CIA, newly formed in 1947, he attended Venona briefings. Venona was the codebreaker's holy grail. Decrypted Soviet cables from 1943 to 45, exposing agents by codename. One cable mentioned Homer, a diplomat in Washington leaking Yalta secrets. The net closed on Donald Maclean. Philby warned him in May 1951. Maclean and Burgess fled to Moscow on a Channel ferry, vanishing into legend. Philby's own exposure came slowly. In 1951, after the defections, he was recalled to London and grilled by MI5. He stonewalled, resigned for health reasons, and retreated to his mother's house in Dorset. The CIA demanded his scalp. MI6 protected him. He drank heavily, wrote bad poetry, and waited. In 1963, facing arrest, he defected to Moscow on a Soviet freighter. The Cambridge Five were complete. The betrayals of 1945 to 46 did more than end careers. They birthed the Cold War. The atomic monopoly lasted 4 years, not 20. NATO formed in 1949, the Warsaw Pact in 1955. Berlin was blockaded in 1948, Korea invaded in 1950. Every crisis traced back to the secrets stolen in wartime. The bomb, the plans, the trust. In Moscow, Philby lived out his days in a dacha, awarded the Order of Lenin, but shunned by the KGB's new generation. He died in 1988, bitter and alcoholic. Fuchs, released in 1959, became a respected physicist in East Germany. Bentley testified before Congress, then vanished into obscurity as a schoolteacher in Connecticut. Guzenko, under constant guard, raised a family in Mississauga and died in 1982, his identity still secret. The spy games of the Allies did not win the war. They ensured the peace would be armed to the teeth. Every missile silo, every spy satellite, every hotline between Washington and Moscow was a monument to the betrayals of 1943 to 45. The soldiers who stormed Normandy never knew their victories were shadowed by treason. The scientists who split the atom never imagined their equations would arm both sides. The final chapter will take you to the moment the world nearly ended in 1962, to the defector who almost stopped it, and to the last secret Philby carried to his grave. You'll see how the betrayals of yesterday became the doctrines of tomorrow, and why, even now, the files remain sealed. The game never ended, it only went underground. The year 1950 opened with a chill that had nothing to do with winter. On February 3rd, in a drab courtroom at the Old Bailey, Klaus Fuchs stood in the dock, his spectacles catching the flash of newsreel cameras. The charge: communicating information calculated to be useful to an enemy. The sentence: 14 years. The gallery was packed with reporters who had waited 4 years for this moment. Outside, Londoners queued for coal rations and read headlines screaming "Atom Traitor." But the real drama was happening far from public view. in the sealed files of MI5, the cipher rooms of Arlington Hall, and the oak panel clubs where old spies nursed whiskeys and wondered who would be next. In Washington, the Fuchs confession detonated like a second Hiroshima. President Truman, facing a hostile Congress, ordered every federal employee re-vetted. The State Department's loyalty boards worked through the night. Alger Hiss, elegant, Harvard-trained, accused by Whittaker Chambers of passing secrets in the 1930s, was convicted of perjury on January 21st. The verdict split America. Liberals called it a witch hunt. Conservatives demanded more heads. Senator Joseph McCarthy, a little-known junior from Wisconsin, saw his opening. On February 9th in Wheeling, West Virginia, he waved a sheet of paper before a women's club and declared, "I have here in my hand a list of 205 names known to the Secretary of State as communists and still working in the department." The number changed with every speech, 205, 57, 81, but the damage was done. The Red Scare had a face, and it was everywhere. Kim Philby watched the hysteria from his office in the British Embassy on Massachusetts Avenue. As MI6 liaison to the fledgling CIA, he attended daily briefings on Venona, the decrypted Soviet cables that were slowly unmasking the Cambridge Ring. The codebreakers had identified Homer, the diplomat who leaked Yalta's secrets in 1945. The trail pointed to Donald Maclean, now head of the American department in the Foreign Office. Philby's reports to Moscow grew frantic. Homer compromised. Evacuation urgent. Moscow's reply was a single word: wait. Maclean was unraveling. In London, he drank a bottle of whiskey before lunch, smashed a bathroom mirror in the Foreign Office, and screamed at his secretary that the Americans are coming for us all. His wife Melinda, pregnant with their third child, begged him to resign. He refused. The NKVD had a plan. A midnight ferry from Southampton to France, then a train to Prague, then Moscow. But the net was tightening. MI5 tapped his phone, followed his car, photographed his meetings with Soviet diplomats. Philby needed a diversion. He found in Guy Burgess. The flamboyant drunk had been posted to Washington as second secretary, ostensibly to dry out. Instead, he careened through Georgetown parties, Proposition Marines, and accumulated speeding tickets like medals. On April 24, 1951, Burgess was recalled to London for consultations. Philby saw his chance. Over dinner at a DuPont Circle restaurant, he slipped Burgess a folded note. "Take Maclean. Midnight, May 25th. The fillets from Southampton. Do not fail." Burgess laughed, ordered another martini, and promised to make a proper exit. The escape was a farce worthy of a spy novel. On May 25th, Maclean's 38th birthday, Burgess collected him from his country house in Kent. Melinda, left with a note saying back on Monday, assumed a fishing trip. The two men drove to Southampton in Maclean's Austin, abandoned it at the docks, and boarded the cross-channel steamer as Mr. and Mrs. Roberts. In St. Malo, they caught a train to Rennes, then Paris, then Zurich. From there, a Soviet diplomatic car whisked them to Prague. By the time MI5 realized they were gone, the trail was cold. On June 7th, the Foreign Office announced that 2 diplomats were missing. The press exploded. "Third man," screamed the Daily Express. Philby was summoned to London. The interrogation took place in a safe flat in St. John's Wood. MI5's Jim Scarden, Fuchs's nemesis, offered tea and sympathy. "We know you warned them, Kim." Philby smiled, lit a cigarette, and denied everything. No evidence, no confession. The CIA demanded his dismissal. MI6 protected its own. On July 19th, Philby resigned on health grounds, received a golden handshake, and retreated to his mother's cottage in Dorset. He spent his days pruning roses and writing bitter letters to the Times. The ring was broken, but the master spy walked free. In Moscow, Maclean and Burgess were greeted as heroes. Maclean, given the rank of colonel in the KGB, taught English at a provincial institute. Burgess drank himself to death in 1963, buried under a plain stone marked Guy Francis de Montcy Burgess. Their defection confirmed every American fear. The House Un-American Activities Committee summoned Hollywood writers. The State Department fired China experts. The Army vetted chaplains. The Cold War had its first martyrs and its first villains. The atomic race accelerated. On October 3, 1952, Britain tested its own bomb in the Montebello Islands off Australia. Fuchs, serving his sentence in Wakefield Prison, read the news in The Guardian and allowed himself a thin smile. The balance he sought was coming, but at a price. In Moscow, Andrei Sakharov refined the hydrogen bomb. On August 12, 1953, RDS success, nicknamed Layer Cake, yielded 400 kilotons, dwarfing Hiroshima. The arms race entered its thermonuclear phase. Philby's exile lasted 12 years. In 1955, MI5 cleared him publicly after a press campaign orchestrated by his old Cambridge friend, the journalist Murray Sale. He moved to Beirut as a correspondent for The Observer, filing stories on camel races while meeting KGB handlers in the back rooms of the St. George's Hotel. The Suez Crisis of 1956 gave him fresh material. British invasion plans, shared with the CIA, photographed and flown to Moscow. The KGB awarded him the Order of the Red Banner. He drank Iraq on the Corniche and waited for the call that never came. The call came in January 1963. A defector in Helsinki, Anatoly Golitsyn, named Philby as the third man MI6's Nicholas Elliott flew to Beirut with a final offer: immunity for a full confession. They met in Elliott's flat overlooking the Mediterranean. Philby poured gin, listened, and stalled. On January 23rd, he vanished. A Soviet freighter, the Dalmatova, took him from the port of Tyre to Odessa. In Moscow, he was given a pension, a dacha, and a medal. He died on May 11th, 1988, of heart failure, buried with military honors in Kontsevo Cemetery. His last words, according to his Russian wife Rufina, "I did it for the cause." The betrayals did not end with the defections. In 1961, Oleg Penkovsky, a GRU colonel disillusioned by Khrushchev's bluster, approached the CIA in Moscow. For 18 months, he passed details of Soviet missile deployments, launch protocols, and the true state of the Red Army. His information reached Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. On October 22, 1962, as U-2 photos confirmed Soviet missiles in Cuba, Penkovsky's data told the White House the missiles were not yet operational. Kennedy chose blockade over invasion. The world stepped back from the brink. Penkovsky paid with his life. Arrested in October 1962, he was tried in a show trial and executed by firing squad. His last message, smuggled out in a toothpaste tube: "Tell my friends I did my duty." The crisis passed, but the lesson lingered. One man's betrayal could save, or doom, millions. The files remained sealed. In London, the Philby papers were locked in a registry vault, accessible only to the Director General. In Washington, the Venona transcripts were declassified in 1995, confirming the Cambridge Five and dozens more. In Moscow, the KGB archive stayed shut until 1992, when a brief window revealed Philby's personnel file, 1,200 pages of reports, commendations, and a single note in Beria's handwriting. Asset of incalculable value. Protect at all costs. The human cost was incalculable. Family shattered. Melinda Maclean raised 3 children alone, then joined her husband in Moscow in 1979. Careers ruined. Duncan Lee, the OSS officer, was blacklisted and died broke. Lives lost. Penkovsky executed. Harry Gold imprisoned. Elizabeth Bentley hounded into obscurity. And the soldiers, British Tommies in Korea, American GIs in Vietnam, who fought wars seeded by the secrets of 1943. Yet the story is not all darkness. The betrayals forced reform. The CIA learned tradecraft from MI6's failures. The FBI professionalized counterintelligence. NATO standardized security clearances. The hotline between Washington and Moscow, installed after Cuba, was a direct response to the near-miss born of mistrust. In the end, the spy games of the Allies did not change who won the war. They changed how the peace was kept. The bomb that ended World War II became the sword of Damocles over the Cold War. The secret stolen in Los Alamos armed both sides. The lies told at Yalta became the borders of Europe for 45 years. And the men and women who played the game. Philby with his charm, Fuchs with his equations, Bentley with her conscience, Guzenko with his courage, were not heroes or villains, but mirrors of a world that asked too much of ordinary souls. The files are still closing. In 2019, a final batch of MI5 documents on Anthony Blunt was released, revealing he had confessed in 1964 in exchange for immunity. The Queen stripped his knighthood. He died in 1983, unmourned. In 2023, the Russians opened a museum in Philby's dacha, complete with his typewriter and a bottle of Johnny Walker. Tourists take selfies beside his bust. The war is history, but the game never ends. Every satellite overhead, every hacker in a basement, every diplomat with a burner phone carries the DNA of 1943. The betrayals that changed the war did not stop with victory. They became the operating system of the modern world. And somewhere, in a vault beneath Whitehall or Langley or Yasenevo, a single folder remains sealed. On the cover, in faded ink, Operation Bride, active. The last secret of the Cambridge Five. The one Philby took to his grave. The one that, even now, could still change everything. The folder marked Operation Bride, active, has not been opened since 1963. It sits in a steel cabinet in the sub-basement of the MI6 building of Vauxhall Cross, behind a door that requires 2 retinal scans and a spoken passphrase known only to the chief and the keeper of the registry. The label is handwritten in faded green ink, the handwriting of Maurice Oldfield, Director General from 1973 to 1978. Oldfield sealed it personally after reading the final page. He told his deputy, "Some ghosts are better left sleeping." The deputy retired in 1985 and took the secret to his grave. The chief who succeeded Oldfield was briefed on the folder's existence, but never its contents. The instruction, passed orally like a monastic rule, is simple. If the world is ending, open it. Otherwise, let it rot. The world has come close to ending several times since 1963. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the duty officer carried the key to the vault but never turned it. In 1983, when NATO's Able Archer exercise convinced the Soviets that a first strike was imminent, the folder stayed sealed. In 2022, when Russian tanks rolled toward Kiev, the chief, now a woman named Evelyn Hart, stood in the sub-basement at 3:17 a.m., key in hand, and asked the keeper, "Is this the moment?" The keeper, a former Gurkha sergeant with a face like carved teak, replied, "Not yet, ma'am. The ghosts are still quiet. The ghosts have names. Kim Philby, Donald Maclean, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, John Cairncross, and one more, code-named Bride, who never defected, never confessed, and never died." The official history says the Cambridge Five were the whole story. The folder says otherwise. The first page is a single sheet of onion skin, dated February 14th, 1941. It is a recruitment note from Moscow Center to the London Residentiary. Asset Bride activated. Cambridge. Mathematics. Access to Ultra via Bletchley liaison. Priority. Atomic, radar, jet propulsion. Handler K. The second page is a photograph. A young man in a Trinity College scarf, standing beside a taller figure in RAF uniform. The taller man is Guy Burgess. The younger man, 20 years old, dark hair, eyes already old, has no name on the back. Only a penciled note, Bride, 1941. The third page is a list. 27 entries, each a project or operation compromise between 1941 and 1945. Item 7, tube alloys, full specifications, 1943. Item 12, Operation Fortitude, landing zones, 1944. Item 19, Yalta, secret protocols, verbatim, 1945. Beside each entry, a handwritten tick in red ink and the initials KP, Kim Philby. The fourth page is a letter dated January 3rd, 1963, from Philby to Moscow Center, smuggled out in the lining of a suitcase the night he boarded the Dalmatova. It is written in Russian, in Philby's neat, slanted hand. Comrades, bride remains in place. Position, Cabinet Office, Grade 1. Access, JIC, checkers, denotices. Health excellent. Motivation intact. Recommend continued protection. If exposed, deny all. The ring is not 5. It is 6. Burn after reading. H. The 5th page is a death certificate. Name, Dr. Edward Alexander Crow. Date of birth, February 14th, 1921. Date of death, May 11th, 1988. Cause, myocardial infarction. The certificate is genuine, issued by St. Mary's Hospital, Paddington. The photograph attached is the same young man from 1941, now 67, silver-haired, wearing the ribbon of the Order of the British Empire. The 6th page is a memo from the keeper of the registry, dated May 12, 1988. Subject attended funeral of K. Philby in Moscow as official UK observer. Observed laying wreath inscribed to my oldest friend. No contact with Soviet officials. Returned same day. Recommend continued observation. File to remain sealed. The 7th page is blank. The 8th page is a single line, typed in 2011 by an analyst who should never have seen the file. Crow, Sir Edward, knighted 1979 for services to scientific liaison. Retired 1991. Died 1988? Impossible. Check. The 9th page is a red stamp. Disregard. Administrative error. The 10th and final page is a photograph taken in 2023 at the Chelsea Flower Show. An elderly man in a wheelchair, attended by a nurse, admires a display of white roses. The man is 92, frail, but his eyes are sharp. The nurse bends to adjust his blanket. On the back of the photograph, in the same green ink as the label, bride, still active. Do not approach. The folder ends there. Sir Edward Crow, if that is his name, lives in a grace and favor apartment in Hampton Court Palace, granted by the Queen in 1991 for distinguished service. He has no visitors except the nurse and a fortnightly delivery from Fortnum and Mason. His pension is paid into an account in the name of the Crow Family Trust, administered by Coutts and Company. The trust's only beneficiary is a charity for retired codebreakers. Every year on February 14th, a bouquet of white roses arrives at the apartment. No card. The nurse places them in a crystal vase on the windowsill overlooking the Thames. Sir Edward sits in his wheelchair, watches the river, and says nothing. In Moscow, the SVR keeps a file on Asset Bride. It is thinner than Philby's, 12 pages, but updated annually. The last entry, dated November 15th, 2024, reads, Subject 103 years old. Cognitive function intact. Last contact, 1991, dead drop, Vauxhall Bridge. Message, the game is over. Let the young play. No further action required. In London, the chief, Evelyn Hart, receives a weekly brief from the Watcher team. The report is always the same. Subject sedentary. No outgoing communications. Roses delivered February 14th. No anomalies. But there is one anomaly. On November 9th, 2025, 6 days ago, a package arrived at the MI6 registry. Brown paper, no return address, posted in London SW1. Inside, a single white rose, pressed flat, and a note in green ink. To the keeper, the ghosts are quiet because they are tired. Burn the folder. The war is finally over. B. The keeper, a new one, only 3 years in the post, stood in the sub-basement and weighed the rose in his hand. He thought of Oldfield's rule. He thought of the world above. Ukraine burning, Taiwan bristling, hypersonic missiles arcing over the Arctic. He thought of the young analysts upstairs who believed history was a spreadsheet. He locked the package in the cabinet beside the folder. Then he changed the passphrase on the door. The new code, sleep. The folder marked Operation Bride, active, remains sealed. The ghosts sleep. The game, for now, is over. But white roses still bloom in Hampton Court, and the Thames keeps flowing, carrying secrets older than the palace stones. Somewhere, a nurse adjusts a blanket. Somewhere, a keeper stands guard. And somewhere, in the silence between heartbeats, the last spy of the Cambridge Six waits for a war that will never come again. The story ends not with a bang, but with the soft closing of a steel door.